Hello everyone, Zadex Squared here. Bungie's dropped another article on us talking about, in this case, the abilities and how they're changing in Lightfall. We've got a few super changes, some new fragments in the light subclasses, and just some general talk about the future of Lightfall and abilities. So they just go over here how they want to tune how all of the stats and specifically the ability regeneration works with the grenade, the melee, and class abilities for all three classes. So they're basically reducing the amount of regeneration that a tier 10 stat is going to give you, and they're saying that it's going to be roughly equivalent to the tier 8 in the current system. And then on top of that, each stat, much like how they already talked about how they're changing resilience, they're basically making the gains from each tier a little bit more linear. They just go over a number of mods that they're planning on bringing back in basically the same way, with just basically letting us know that they're planning on reducing the amount of energy that these all take and making it easier for us to actually be able to slot multiple of them in a build. And finally, they're letting us know that they're reducing the cooldown on both Marksman and Gambler's Dodge for Hunters. Moving on, we've got some super changes. They have swapped the number of orbs of power that can be generated by a roaming super and a one-off super like Thunder Crash. So now roaming supers can create 7, and something like a Thunder Crash, any of the one-off supers can only create 5, whereas it was flipped before. And they also say that Well of Radiance, Ward of Dawn, and both Shadow Shots are unchanged. They're reducing the cooldown of the highest tier, the longest tier supers, which are Hammer of Soul, Daybreak, and Spectral Blades, from 1025 to 916, which is the one tier less. And then one of the other major things is that they are nerfing Ward of Dawn specifically in PvP. So they basically said they're reducing the maximum health from 13,500 to 8,000, and then they're just decreasing the amount of damage that PvE combatants do to it to keep that health the same in PvE, or generally the same. They've also standardized the damage dealt by either energy or kinetic weapons. Currently, energy weapons are doing more damage to Ward of Dawn, and kinetic weapons are doing less, and they're basically just moving them both to approximately the midpoint between the two. On top of that, Armor of Light is going to be reduced somewhat, so it's giving you 300 health instead of 425, and it's no longer going to negate precision damage, and it's also now getting the 50% PV damage resistance from Void Overshields. On top of that, they're also nerfing Thunder Crash, so they basically reduced the maximum flight time from 5 seconds to 4.5. They've also made it so that you descend earlier in the flight. And then they've also reduced the amount of the detonation radius that you deal against players, so that, if you land, you're not going to hit as large of an area. And they've also changed the hitbox when you're flying to make it so that flyby disintegrations are a little bit more intentional, which is nice. And then also tacked onto this, they've said they're buffing Fist of Havoc in PvE and increasing that damage by 20%. They are also changing Spark of Resistance. They're basically just making it so you need 3 enemies instead of 2 to activate, and that it doesn't linger for as long once you're not surrounded anymore, cutting that in half from 4 seconds to 2. And then with Solar, they are buffing both Daybreak and Phoenix Dive for Warlocks, because both of them are very, very weak right now, especially when you compare that to Well, or to, in Phoenix Dive's case, either of the other rifts. So Daybreak is using less super energy every swing, so it's going to be reduced from 10% to 6.5%, and it's going to just do more damage. It's doing 25% more damage in PvE, which is great, especially with some of the other changes we're getting with Solar 3.0 on Warlock. It might actually be viable to use. One of those changes being Phoenix Dive, the base cooldowns being reduced from 82 seconds to 55 seconds, While Heat Rises is active, the restoration is increased from 1 second to 3 seconds, which is great. And then the thing that works with Daybreak is that while Daybreak is active, the cooldown is significantly reduced, meaning that you're more able to actually do some rapid reactivations of it. And on top of that, the maximum damage is increased from 80 damage to 220 damage. So that will help not only Phoenix Dive, but also Daybreak. On top of that, they are changing how physics works with collision damage, where it's completely non-lethal now, which means that your friend trying to troll you with an eager-edged sword, not going to kill you. Phalanx turning in the wrong way, or an enemy stomping you into a wall, not going to kill you, especially for GMs and for, solo dungeon runs and stuff like that. That's huge. They're also planning on a mid-season update to remove the lethality from fall damage as well, so that all fall damage is also non-lethal. Finally, they've shown off some of the new fragments that they're going to be introducing. They're basically just introducing some new ones just for, more build options, and then also introducing or changing old ones to interact with the Void Breachers and Fire Sprites when they add those. Obviously, Arc already has the Ionic Traces, but Void and Solar don't have anything yet. And because of how they're changing the mods and build crafting in Lightfall, they're adding these new things called Void Breaches and Fire Sprites, which will perform very similarly to Ionic Traces, and then to how Stasis Shards work for Stasis. So on Arc, we have 2 new fragments. One is Spark of Instinct. When critically wounded, taking damage from nearby enemies emits a burst of damaging arc energy that jolts targets. This is actually a mod that we already currently have, and they're basically also mentioned here that they have added some fragments in to replace any mods that they like but that aren't returning for one reason or another. The other fragment we're getting on Arc is Spark of Haste, which grants you greatly increased resilience, recovery, and mobility while sprinting. This is great for, those Titan builds or those Hunter builds where you're just running at things, meleeing a bunch, and, just increasing your stats a little bit, making it so you're less likely to die, more able to actually run around, especially if you're, if you've got speed boost with mobility. Having more mobility is nice. For Solar, we have 2 new fragments. We have the Fire Sprites being added, and 3 of the old fragments are getting changes to work with Fire Sprites. So starting off, we just have Fire Sprites here. They're just telling us what they do, which is basically they're created by some of these fragments, and then on top of that, picking them up will grant grenade energy. This is great for a Titan using Ashen Wake or a Warlock running Starfire Protocol in order to just get more grenade energy. For the 2 new fragments, we have Ember of Mercy, which when you revive an ally, gives you and nearby allies restoration, and picking up a Fire Sprite will grant restoration. This is going to be just a good general tank, especially for, master dungeons and stuff like that, just being able to help keep your teammates alive a little bit easier. And then Ember of Resolve, which basically makes it so Solar Grenade Final Blows cure you. This is going to be great for any difficult activity where you'd like to run healing nades, but you don't want to run healing nades, just letting you get some health, getting the cure from normal grenade kills. Then the 3 changes are Ember of Tempering, which will now create a Fire Sprite on Solar weapon kills, and then Ember of Combustion will create a Fire Sprite on Solar super defeats, and Ember of Searing will create a Fire Sprite when defeating scorched targets. All 3 of these are in addition to their original effects, which means that they are just getting slightly buffed, giving us the ability to create Fire Sprites, which with some of the new mods that we're going to be getting is probably going to be pretty good. Then for Void, you have the Void Breaches, which are created by a selection of these new fragments, or the returning fragments that are getting changed, and it'll grant class ability energy on pickup. So for the 2 new fragments, we have Echo of Cessation. Finisher Final Blows create a burst of void damage that causes nearby enemies to become volatile. Defeating volatile targets creates a void breach. I think this is going to be great on the Severance Enclosure build that I just posted a couple of days ago. Just making it so that finishers help you get volatile on enemies. Not necessarily the most useful thing in the world for most people, but it will definitely be helpful in certain situations depending on your build. Echo of Vigilance makes it so that when you defeat a target, when your shields are depleted, it grants you a temporary void overshield, which is insanely useful for any melee builds that you might be trying to pull off, from the Severance Enclosure build that I posted to any sort of Worm God Caress or Synthoceps builds, just basically making it so you can keep your Void Overshield up when you're running and meleeing things where you're taking a lot of damage, and also just incredibly helpful for general gameplay, especially on Titans where, you know, you're getting low, you kill something, voila, you get a Void Overshield, helps you stay alive a little bit longer. Then the 3 current fragments that are getting changes to add Void Breaches or to have interactions with Void Breaches are Echo of Domineering. It's now going to create a Void Breach when you defeat a suppressed target. Echo of Harvest is now going to create a Void Breach when defeating a weakened target with precision damage. And Echo of Starvation is the one I'm most interested in out of all of these. Will now grant Devour on picking up a Void Breach, making it much easier, much easier for both Titans and Hunters to get Devour. Currently, the only way to do it is to pick up an Orb of Power, which isn't the most difficult thing in the world, but isn't also all that easy with how they changed Orbs of Power last year. So now being able to get Devour by picking up a Void Breach as well is very helpful. But anyways, guys, I've been Zadik Squared. Thanks for watching.